Before we dive into today's extraordinary developments, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for the most up-to-date coverage of the Diddy trial. Enable notifications to stay informed as this unprecedented case unfolds. The courthouse fell into complete silence this morning. Not the normal quiet of legal proceedings, but the heavy stillness that comes when something truly unexpected occurs. Day 17 of the Diddy Combs trial had begun like the others. Procedural motions, evidence reviews, and the methodical pace of justice. Then, without warning or prior announcement, Janice Combs was escorted into the courtroom. For those unfamiliar, Janice Combs is not just any witness. She is Diddy's mother, the woman he has repeatedly credited for his success, the one he has publicly honored with lavish gifts and emotional tributes throughout his career. Her unexpected appearance sent immediate ripples through the courtroom. Diddy, who had maintained remarkable composure through weeks of damaging testimony, visibly faltered. His attorneys appeared equally stunned, exchanging alarmed glances and hurriedly shuffling through papers as if searching for information about this development that clearly hadn't been anticipated. As Mrs. Combs took her seat at the witness stand, the contrast between mother and son was striking. She sat upright, dignified in a simple navy dress, her expression resolute, though lined with unmistakable pain. Diddy, meanwhile, seemed to physically diminish, his shoulders hunching forward, his practiced confidence evaporating in real time. The lead prosecutor approached with careful respect. "Mrs. Combs, thank you for being here today. Could you please state your relationship to the defendant for the record?" Her voice was clear and steady as she responded. "Sean is my son, my only son. And Mrs. Combs, are you testifying today, voluntarily?" She nodded once, then spoke directly into the microphone. "Yes. After much prayer and consideration, I am here of my own free will." That simple statement seemed to hit Diddy harder than any previous testimony. For the first time since the trial began, he closed his eyes, unable to maintain the direct gaze he had fixed on every previous witness. Before continuing, we must emphasize that the following content is drawn directly from federal court proceedings. This information is presented for educational purposes only, and viewer discretion is advised. Nobody expected Janice Combs to testify against her son. The room was absolutely still. Eyes moved between mother and son as she was sworn in, the Bible steady in her hand despite the weight of the moment. No media leak had foreshadowed this development. No insider had hinted at this possibility. Even the most seasoned courtroom reporters appeared stunned, their usual professional detachment momentarily shaken by the raw human drama unfolding before them. Until this moment, the case had followed predictable patterns. Business associates, former employees, and alleged victims providing testimony that Diddy's defense team worked systematically to discredit or contextualize. But something fundamentally different emanated from Mrs. Combs. Perhaps it was her quiet dignity, the absence of any apparent anger or vindictiveness. Perhaps it was the painful authenticity of a mother forced to confront difficult truths about her child. Whatever the quality, it commanded the complete attention of everyone present. Janice Combs wasn't testifying as a business partner with financial grievances or as an employee with workplace complaints. She was there as the one person whose love for the defendant was unquestionable, whose support had been a constant throughout his life, and whose appearance on the prosecution's side represented a devastating personal and public rupture. And when she began to speak, her words carried a moral authority that transcended the legal proceedings. Because what Mrs. Combs revealed about her gradual awakening to troubling patterns, her private attempts at intervention, and her ultimate decision to speak publicly wasn't just compelling testimony. It was a mother's painful reckoning with her own role in enabling behaviors she could no longer defend. "I need to begin by acknowledging how difficult this is," Mrs. Combs stated, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "No mother ever imagined sitting in a courtroom testifying in a case against her child. This is not a role I ever wanted or expected to play." The judge nodded with unusual sympathy, while jurors leaned forward, clearly understanding the significance of this witness. Diddy's defense team appeared paralyzed, unsure how to respond to this unanticipated development. "I've spent decades being Sean's strongest defender," Mrs. Combs continued. "I've celebrated his successes, justified his excesses, and dismissed criticisms as jealousy or misunderstanding. But over time, incidents and patterns emerged that I could no longer explain away or ignore, even to myself." She paused briefly, gathering herself. "I'm here today not to condemn my son, whom I love dearly, but to speak truth that might ultimately help him and prevent further harm to others. Sometimes the most painful honesty is also the most necessary." It started like any other day of the ITU trial. Spectators filed in, legal teams organized their materials, journalists settled into their designated area. But when the bailiff announced, "The United States calls Janice Combs," the routine proceedings transformed instantly. Reporters straightened, onlookers murmured in disbelief, and Diddy himself appeared to freeze mid-conversation with his attorney. The judge silenced the courtroom with a stern look, and Diddy, who had projected controlled confidence throughout previous testimonies, suddenly looked vulnerable in a way no one had witnessed before. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that seemed more consoling than strategic. Janice Combs walked to the witness stand with dignified purpose. No dramatic entrance, no emotional display, just the measured steps of someone who had made a difficult but necessary decision. "Mrs. Combs," the prosecutor began respectfully, "could you share with the court your understanding of your son's business practices and personal conduct over the years?" Mrs. Combs straightened slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "Sean was always ambitious, even as a child, determined, charismatic, capable of inspiring others. These qualities served him well as he built his career. I watched with pride as he transformed from a local promoter to a global entrepreneur." She described the early years of Bad Boy Records, the excitement of building something from nothing, the thrill of discovering new artists, the family atmosphere that characterized those initial successes. "But success changed things," she continued. "As the company grew, as money became more plentiful, I began noticing subtle shifts in Sean's behavior and in the culture around him." Mrs. Combs recounted how she had initially attributed these changes to the natural pressures of fame and business expansion, how she had rationalized certain behaviors as necessary adaptations to an industry known for its ruthlessness. "I told myself that the music business required a certain toughness, that the lifestyle came with particular excesses. I believed Sean when he assured me that everything was under control, that his methods were simply how business operated at that level." The prosecutor presented several photographs spanning decades, images showing Diddy's evolution from eager young entrepreneur to powerful industry figure. Mrs. Combs identified each, occasionally offering context about her impressions at those different stages. "This was his first major awards ceremony," she noted, pointing to an early image. "He was still grounded then, still connected to the values I had raised him with." She paused at a later photograph. "By this point, I was already seeing concerning he. Signs. The entourage had changed. The people closest to him seemed selected more for loyalty than integrity." The prosecutor nodded. When did you begin having serious concerns about your son's conduct? Mrs. Combs took a measured breath. There wasn't a single moment, but rather an accumulation of incidents that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Around 2006, I began hearing stories, not from the media or from strangers, but from people I knew personally, people who had no reason to lie. She described how young artists who had once spoken enthusiastically about working with her son now seemed reluctant to discuss their experiences. How former employees would become uncomfortable when his name arose in conversation. How certain associates seemed to operate with a fearfulness that contradicted the family atmosphere Diddy publicly promoted. As a mother, you develop instincts about when something isn't right, even when you can't immediately identify what that something is, she said. I began having that feeling more and more frequently. I've struggled with this decision for years, Mrs. Combs said, her composure remarkable despite the obvious emotional toll. I've tried addressing my concerns privately. I've prayed for guidance. I've consulted with spiritual advisors. But ultimately, I realized that my silence was becoming part of the problem. She looked briefly toward her son. I love Sean unconditionally. That will never change. But loving someone doesn't mean enabling behaviors that harm others. Mrs. Combs explained that her concerns evolved gradually, beginning with observations about the business practices at Bad Boy Records that troubled her, moral sensibilities. I raised Sean to value fairness and integrity, she stated. As his success grew, I began noticing discrepancies between these values and how the business operated. Artists would start enthusiastic and end disillusioned. Young women would enter his circle full of ambition and leave with a disturbing quietness about their experiences. The prosecutor presented a series of text messages between mother and son spanning several years. Mrs. Combs confirmed their authenticity, explaining that these represented her attempts to address her growing concerns privately. I tried approaching these issues as a mother first, she explained, asking questions, expressing worries, reminding him of the values that had guided our family. Initially, he would reassure me that everything was being handled ethically, that any complaints were simply the natural friction of a competitive industry. She described how these private conversations evolved over time, from gentle inquiries to more direct confrontations as her concerns deepened. In 2014, after hearing particularly troubling accounts from a young artist's mother who reached out to me directly, I had a more serious conversation with Sean. For the first time, I directly questioned whether success had compromised his moral compass. Mrs. Combs recounted that conversation in detail, describing how Diddy had responded with unprecedented anger, accusing her of disloyalty and failing to understand the realities of the industry. He told me, "Mom, this is how the game works. Everyone knows the rules when they sign up." When I pressed about specific allegations of exploitation, he said something I'll never forget. "They're getting exactly what they signed for. If they didn't read the fine print, that's not my problem." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Mrs. Combs continued, detailing how her relationship with her son had become increasingly strained as she refused to accept these justifications. I reminded him that I hadn't raised him to view business as a game where people could be manipulated or exploited. I told him that regardless of what papers someone signed, there are moral obligations that transcend contracts. The prosecutor presented another piece of evidence, a letter Mrs. Combs had written to her son in 2016, expressing her deep concerns about reports she had received regarding treatment of young women at certain private gatherings. I wrote this after hearing consistent accounts from multiple sources, she explained. These weren't rumors from strangers, but testimonies from people within Sean's circle who had approached me confidentially. Knowing my values, and hoping I might influence my son. The letter, read aloud in court, contained painful questions about power dynamics, consent, and moral responsibility. It concluded with a mother's plea. The success I wanted for you was never meant to come at the expense of others' dignity or well-being. Please remember the man I raised you to be. Did you receive a response to this letter? The prosecutor asked. Not directly, Mrs. Combs replied. Sean stopped taking my calls for several months afterward. When we eventually resumed contact, it was with an unspoken agreement not to discuss these concerns. Our relationship became increasingly superficial. Public appearances maintained the image of closeness, but privately, we had reached an impasse. She paused, then continued with quiet determination. That was the beginning of my understanding that private interventions would not be sufficient, that the patterns I was witnessing might require a more difficult form of accountability. Mrs. Combs took a moment to collect herself, then continued with renewed clarity. The prosecutor guided her to elaborate on the patterns of behavior she had observed over years of close association with her son's business and personal circles. What troubled me most deeply wasn't just individual incidents, she explained. It was recognizing a systematic approach to how people were treated. A pattern that became more pronounced as Sean's power and influence grew. She described observing how her son's organization categorized people based on their utility and compliance. Those who followed directions without question were rewarded, while those who raised concerns were systematically isolated and often discredited. I watched how quickly someone could go from being family to being treated as an outsider, Mrs. Combs stated. The language would change. Someone who had been a trusted colleague suddenly became difficult or ungrateful after questioning business practices or expressing concerns about conduct they had witnessed. The prosecutor displayed several photographs taken at various events over the years, asking Mrs. Combs to identify individuals and comment on their changing status within her son's circle. This young man was once described by Sean as the future of the label, she said, indicating a former artist. After he requested an audit of his royalty statements, I never saw him at another company event, and Sean stopped mentioning him entirely. His album release was repeatedly delayed until eventually he disappeared from public view. She identified similar patterns with several others, individuals who had been prominently featured in Diddy's orbit before suddenly vanishing from that circle after showing signs of independence or questioning. As a mother, I recognized the signs of emotional manipulation that I would never have tolerated in our household, Mrs. Combs stated. The creation of dependency, the withdrawal of approval as punishment, the isolation of anyone who challenged established narratives. She described how she had observed the construction of what she called layers of insulation around her son, tiers of employees whose primary function seemed to be managing problems before they reached him directly. There were people whose entire job appeared to be making situations disappear, she explained. Not solving problems in a transparent way, but ensuring certain realities never became part of the official record. Mrs. Combs recounted how she had once questioned one of these employees directly after witnessing a troubling interaction at a family event. He told me, "Mrs. Combs, my job is to make sure certain conversations never happen. That's how I keep your son protected." She described how this response had deeply disturbed her. Protection shouldn't require suppression of truth. That's not protection. It's enabling. The prosecutor presented text messages between Mrs. Combs and several former associates of Diddy who had reached out to her with concerns they felt unable to address directly with her son. People came to me because they knew I operated from a different value system, she explained. They hoped I might be able to influence situations they felt powerless to change themselves. She detailed how, over time, these communications revealed consistent patterns of intimidation, financial manipulation, and reputation management strategies designed to maintain control over artists and employees. What became clear to me was that this wasn't just about business disagreements or personality conflicts, Mrs. Combs concluded. This was a systematic approach to maintaining power through fear, financial dependency, and the threat of professional destruction. As his mother, I could no longer pretend not to see it. The court took a brief recess, then reconvened with Mrs. Combs returning to the stand. Though still composed, there was a visible emotional weight to her demeanor as the prosecutor moved toward the circumstances that ultimately led to her decision to testify. Mrs. Combs, you've described years of growing concern and private attempts to address issues with your son. What finally brought you to this courtroom today? She folded her hands carefully on her lap. Last year, I received a visit from a young woman. I won't share her name for her privacy and safety. She had been briefly associated with bad boy records and had attended several private events hosted by my son. Mrs. Combs described how this woman had sought her out specifically, believing that as Diddy's mother, she might be the only person with both the moral authority and personal influence to intervene in what she described as increasingly dangerous situations. She shared experiences that went beyond the business practices and power dynamics I had already found troubling. She described behaviors that were not just unethical but potentially criminal, environments where consent was compromised, where documentation of vulnerable moments was used as leverage, where threats maintained silence. The prosecutor presented a heavily redacted written statement that Mrs. Combs identified as her documentation of this conversation, created immediately. Afterward, after she left, I spent the entire night in prayer and reflection. Mrs. Combs continued, I asked myself what my responsibility was. As a mother, as a woman of faith, as someone who had benefited from the success that might have been built partly on the exploitation of others. She described making one final attempt at private intervention, requesting a meeting with her son where she presented the information she had received and asked him directly for honest accountability. It was the most difficult conversation we've ever had, she said, her voice momentarily wavering. I told him I had always defended him, had always believed in his fundamental goodness, despite mistakes, but that I could no longer reconcile the Aikido patterns I was seeing with the values I had raised him to embody. Mrs. Combs recounted Diddy's response. Initial dismissal followed by anger, accusations that she was betraying him by listening to opportunists and liars. Finally, when she persisted, a troubling shift in approach. He told me, Mom, you don't want to get involved in this. There are things you don't understand, things that could blow back on all of us. Just trust me to handle it. She paused, visibly processing the memory. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it. For the first time in my life, I felt my son was threatening me, not physically, but with the implication that my continued questioning could have consequences. Mrs. Combs described leaving that meeting with the devastating realization that her son had become someone she no longer recognized, someone who would attempt to intimidate even his own mother into silence. When I received the subpoena to testify, I could have fought it. I could have claimed family privilege. I could have found ways to avoid this moment, she stated. Instead, after much prayer, I chose to comply voluntarily, to speak truth as, I have witnessed it. She looked directly at the jury. Not to punish my son, but because I believe true love sometimes requires the most painful kind of honesty. Because I've come to understand that my silence, however well-intentioned, may have allowed harm to continue. Mrs. Combs turned briefly toward her son. "And because I still believe in the possibility of redemption. But no, it can only begin with truth and accountability." The prosecution concluded their direct examination, and after a brief consultation, Diddy's lead defense attorney approached for cross-examination. His typically aggressive confidence appeared noticeably subdued as he addressed Mrs. Combs with careful respect. "Mrs. Combs, no one in this courtroom doubts the sincerity of your testimony or the difficulty of your position today," he began. "However, I must ask, aren't your observations necessarily limited to what you've been allowed to see or what others have chosen to tell you?" Mrs. Combs nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "Of course. I don't claim omniscience. I've testified to what I've personally witnessed, conversations I've personally had, and patterns I've observed over decades of close association with my son's business and personal circles." The defense attorney tried to establish distance between Mrs. Combs and the day-to-day operations of Bad Boy Records and Diddy's other business ventures. "You've never been an employee of any of your son's companies, correct? Never served on any board of directors? Never had access to contracts, financial statements, or official business records?" "That's correct," Mrs. Combs confirmed. "My perspective comes from a different position, that of someone who has been present throughout the entirety of my son's career, who has observed the human impact of business practices rather than the paperwork that formalized them." The courtroom remained unusually tense as the defense attorney attempted to suggest that Mrs. Combs's concerns were based on misconceptions or incomplete information. "Isn't it possible that what you perceived as troubling patterns were simply the necessary realities of a highly competitive industry? That your son was making difficult business decisions rather than engaging in the problematic behaviors you've described?" Mrs. Combs maintained her composure. "I raised my son to know the difference between hard business decisions and exploitation, between competitive practices and manipulation. The patterns I've described go well beyond the necessary compromises of business. They reflect a fundamental approach to human relationships that I know I did not instill in him." The defense strategy shifted, moving toward suggesting that Mrs. Combs might have been influenced by individuals with grievances against her son. "You've mentioned being approached by various people with complaints about your son over the years. Isn't it possible that some of these individuals had their own agendas? Perhaps resentments about career disappointments or financial disputes?" "I've considered that possibility with each person who approached me," Mrs. Combs acknowledged. "I've evaluated their credibility, their motivations, their consistency. What ultimately convinced me were the patterns. Different individuals from different periods, with different relationships to my son, describing remarkably similar experiences and behaviors." Throughout the increasingly delicate questioning, Mrs. Combs maintained her dignity, acknowledging limitations in her knowledge when appropriate but standing firm on her direct observations and experiences. In a final, clearly difficult approach, the defense attorney suggested that family dynamics might be influencing her perspective. "Mrs. Combs, parenting a highly successful child must present unique challenges. Is it possible that some of your testimony today reflects the natural tension between a parent's values and an adult child's independent choices? Perhaps even disappointment that your son's world has evolved beyond your influence?" The courtroom fell completely silent as Mrs. Combs took a moment before responding, her gaze steady. "I have never expected my adult son to live exactly as I would choose. I've respected his independence and celebrated his success, even when his choices wouldn't have been my own," she said quietly. "What brings me here today isn't disappointed expectations or a desire for control." She paused, then continued with quiet strength. "It's the recognition that there are universal principles that transcend personal choices. principles of human dignity, of consent, of truth. My testimony isn't about imposing my values on my son's world. It's about acknowledging where that world appears to have violated values that should be universal. Mrs. Combs then looked directly at her son for the first time since cross-examination began. Diddy, who had been staring downward throughout most of her testimony, slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. "I love you, Sean," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her expression. "And love requires truth, even when that truth is painful." The defense had no further questions when Janice Combs finally stepped down from the witness stand after nearly 5 hours of testimony. The courtroom remained in stunned silence. The impact of a mother testifying against her son, not with anger or vindictiveness, but with painful clarity and evident love, had created an atmosphere unlike anything previously experienced in the proceedings. Diddy sat motionless at the defense table, his typical confidence completely stripped away. For perhaps the first time, the public saw not the carefully constructed image of a music mogul, but simply a son devastated by his mother's truth. His legal team appeared equally affected, their usual strategic whispers replaced by uncertain glances and concerned observations of their client's state. The prosecution had achieved something no previous testimony had accomplished: breaking through not just the legal defense, but the emotional armor Diddy had maintained throughout the trial. The image of his mother's measured testimony, delivered with obvious pain but unwavering conviction, resonated with a moral authority that transcended typical courtroom dynamics. Outside the courthouse, reaction was subdued rather than sensationalized. Media commentary focused not on scandal, but on the profound human element of the day's proceedings. Legal analysts noted the unique impact of Mrs. Combs's testimony, one commenting, "We've seen mother-child testimony in court before, but almost. Always with a parent defending their child. This reversal, a mother feeling ethically compelled to testify against her son while clearly still loving him, creates a different kind of credibility that's difficult to counter." Mrs. Combs left through a private exit, declining all requests for comments or interviews. Court officials reported that she had requested no special accommodations beyond basic privacy measures, consistent with the dignified approach she had maintained throughout her testimony. The impact extended beyond the courtroom into broader conversations about parental responsibility, moral courage, and the painful choices sometimes required by ethical conviction. Social media reflected this more nuanced discussion, with many expressing respect for Mrs. Combs's evident struggle between maternal loyalty and moral integrity. For Diddy, the strategic and emotional challenge was unprecedented. Unlike previous witnesses whose credibility his team had worked to undermine, his mother's testimony came from someone whose character and intentions were beyond question. Her account couldn't be dismissed as opportunism or resentment. It represented the painful conclusions of someone who had every reason to defend him, but had instead chosen truth. Legal experts noted that the case had entered new territory. "What we witnessed today fundamentally changes the narrative," one former prosecutor commented. "This isn't just about specific allegations anymore. It's about a pattern of behavior so concerning that it compelled the ultimate insider, his own mother, to break her silence despite the personal cost." As Day 17 of the trial concluded, the judge issued additional instructions to the jury about evaluating testimony from family members, acknowledging the unique nature of the day's proceedings. The trial would continue, but something essential had shifted. The carefully maintained public persona had cracked, revealing glimpses of the man behind the image, a man whose own mother, while still expressing love for him, could no longer defend his actions or remain silent about her concerns. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for continuing coverage of this landmark case. Turn on notifications to ensure you receive immediate updates as this extraordinary trial continues to unfold.